It was the winter of 1956, and New York City was in the middle of a war it didn't fully understand yet. On one side stood the old world, the world of tuxedos, cigarette smoke, and ballrooms where men in suits played music for other men in suits. On the other side stood something new, something loud, something that made parents nervous and teenagers feel alive. And somewhere in the middle of that battle stood two men who had no idea their names would one day be mentioned in the same breath. One was the most powerful singer in the world. The other was a young man from Harlem who hadn't yet figured out what he was capable of. Their story didn't start with a handshake or a meeting. It started with a radio broadcast, a few careless words, and a crowd of 20,000 people who would eventually make the final judgment. Frank Sinatra was 50 years old in the music business before most people his age had found their footing. He had survived the big band era, the collapse of his early career, the personal scandals, the years when people said he was finished, and he had come back stronger every single time. By 1956, Frank Sinatra was not just a singer. He was an institution. He was the sound of sophistication, of late nights and old whiskey, and the kind of romance that made you feel like life was worth living even when it wasn't. When Frank Sinatra walked into a room, the room changed. When Frank Sinatra opened his mouth, arguments stopped. He was, by every measure that mattered in the music world of that era, the undisputed king. And kings, by nature, do not always appreciate the arrival of new claimants to the throne. The broadcast happened on a Tuesday afternoon. A popular New York radio host was conducting what was supposed to be a casual conversation with Sinatra about his new album, his upcoming residency in Las Vegas, and his thoughts on the current state of American music. The interview was going smoothly, the way interviews with Sinatra always went when he was in a good mood, which was when he was in control. He spoke about melody, about phrasing, about the lost art of really listening to a lyric before you tried to sing it. He spoke about the musicians he admired, the ones who understood that music was not just sound but story. Then the host shifted the conversation. He mentioned the new wave. He mentioned the teenagers who were filling arenas and buying records in numbers that were making the old guard uncomfortable. He mentioned, almost casually, a few names, and one of those names was Frankie Lymon. Sinatra paused, not the pause of a man searching for words, but the pause of a man deciding which words to use. Then he spoke, and what he said was heard by hundreds of thousands of people tuning in across New York and beyond. He said that music required something that could not be manufactured or rushed. He said that the best music came from a place of lived experience, from knowing real joy and real sorrow and real loss. He said that the young performers currently filling the charts were talented, perhaps in a surface way, but that they were singing about feelings they had not yet earned the right to sing about. He said that music required age, required depth, required a certain weight that only time could provide. The host pressed him gently. He mentioned Frankie Lymon specifically. He asked Sinatra directly what he thought of the young singer from Harlem, whose record had been inescapable that year. Sinatra's answer was brief. He said that Frankie Lymon had a pleasant voice. He said that pleasant voices were not rare. He said that what separated a singer from a great singer was something that took years to develop, and that no amount of natural talent could substitute for time and experience. Then he moved on, the way powerful men move on from things they consider beneath serious discussion. He shrugged it off, not with cruelty, but with the casual dismissal of a man who genuinely could not imagine being threatened by someone so young. The interview ended. The broadcast continued, and somewhere in Harlem, a young man named Frankie Lymon heard every word. Frankie Lymon had grown up in Washington Heights, in a part of New York City that most of the people who ran the music business had never visited and never intended to. His father sang in a gospel group. His mother kept the family together through sheer force of determination. Frankie had grown up surrounded by music the way some children grow up surrounded by books or sports or religion. It was simply the air he breathed. By the time he was a teenager, he had already been performing for years, not on big stages with professional lighting and sound equipment, but in the way that actually matters, in churches and community halls and street corners where the audience had not come to be impressed, but simply to feel something. When Frankie Lymon and the teenagers released their record, nobody in the industry establishment had predicted what happened next. The song moved through the country like something that could not be stopped. It crossed racial lines at a time when that was genuinely remarkable. It crossed generational lines in ways that even more progressive observers found surprising. Teenagers played it. Their older siblings played it. Radio stations that had never played music from young black artists from Harlem were suddenly playing it because their listeners demanded it. Frankie Lymon was not yet 20 years old when all of this happened. He was a young man who had never had the luxury of thinking about music as a career or a business or a statement. He had simply done what he had always done, which was open his mouth and let out what was inside him. And then Frank Sinatra, the most respected voice in American music, went on the radio and suggested, politely but unmistakably, that what Frankie Lymon was doing was not quite the real thing. The reaction in Harlem was immediate. The people who had watched Frankie grow up, who had been in those churches and community halls, who knew what was in that voice and where it came from, were not pleased. The young performers who had been inspired by Frankie, who had looked at his success and seen a door opening for the first time, felt the dismissal as something personal because it was personal. It was the oldest story in American music, the story of who gets to decide what counts as serious and what gets dismissed as a passing trend. But Frankie himself did not respond publicly, not immediately. The people around him, the managers and the record company representatives, and the various adults who had attached themselves to his sudden success, urged him to stay quiet, to not engage, to let it pass. They told him that arguing with Frank Sinatra was a losing proposition, that Sinatra had been in this business longer than Frankie had been alive, that nothing good could come from a public confrontation. Frankie listened to them the way young people sometimes listen to older people. With his ears, but not with his heart. He had a concert scheduled for the following week. Madison Square Garden, 20,000 seats. The tickets had sold out within hours of going on sale, which was, it should be noted, something that had not happened for every performer who played that famous building. The demand had surprised even the people who had booked the show, who had expected a good turnout, but had not anticipated the kind of response that made it necessary to turn people away at the door. In the days between the radio broadcast and the concert, something changed in Frankie Lymon. The people close to him noticed it. He became quieter than usual. He spent more time alone. He was not brooding in the way of someone who is angry, but focused in the way of someone who has found something to aim at. He rehearsed differently. He did not talk about Sinatra. He did not talk about the interview. He simply worked with a concentration and a seriousness that made the musicians around him take notice. The night of the Madison Square Garden concert arrived cold and clear, the kind of New York winter night where your breath makes clouds in the air and the city feels more alive than usual, as if the cold has stripped away everything unnecessary and left only the essential. The crowd outside was not the quiet, orderly crowd of a classical concert or a jazz club performance. It was the crowd of something new, something that had not yet learned how to contain itself because nobody had told it yet that it needed to. Inside, the building was already warm with 20,000 bodies before the lights went down. Frankie Lymon walked out onto that stage alone, without the full band, without the elaborate introduction that had been planned, without any of the staging that had been carefully arranged in the days before. He walked out with just a microphone and the crowd, which had been building toward an eruption for the past hour, went completely silent. Not the silence of disappointment, but the silence of recognition. The silence of 20,000 people suddenly understanding that something important was about to happen. He did not mention Frank Sinatra. He did not mention the radio interview. He did not acknowledge, in any direct way, the conversation that had been happening about him and his music and his right to be taken seriously. He simply began to sing. What happened in the next 2 hours was described differently by everyone who was there. Some people, writing about it later, reached for technical language, talking about his phrasing, his control, his instinctive understanding of when to push and when to hold back. Others, less comfortable with technical language, simply said that it was the best concert they had ever attended, and some of these people had attended a great many concerts. A few people tried to explain what made it different from other performances they had seen, and found themselves unable to fully articulate it, settling for descriptions like "hoot felt real," and "you believed every word," and was completely present in a way that most performers are not. What everyone agreed on was that Frankie Lymon performed that night as if he had something to prove, not in the anxious, effortful way of someone desperate for approval, but in the clear-eyed, focused way of someone who knows exactly what they are capable of, and has decided that tonight is the night to show it complete. Every song was complete in a way that earlier performances had sometimes not been. Every emotion was fully committed to. There was no holding back, no saving something for another night. He gave everything he had to 20,000 people in a cold building in New York City, and they gave everything they had back to him. The next morning, the reviews came in. The critics who had covered the concert, some of whom had been skeptical going in, some of whom had been assigned the story because their editors considered it a youth culture piece rather than a music piece, wrote about it in ways that surprised their own publications. The words that kept appearing in review after review were words like maturity and depth and emotional intelligence. One critic, a man who had been writing about music for 30 years and who was not known for generosity toward new performers, wrote that what Frankie Lymon had done the previous night at Madison Square Garden was not the performance of a pleasant-voiced young man riding a trend. It was, he wrote, the performance of an artist who understood exactly what he was doing and why. The contrast with Sinatra's words on the radio was not lost on anyone. Within a week, the story of the concert had spread far beyond New York. It was discussed in newspapers across the country, in music industry publications, in the kind of conversations that happen between people who care about where music is going and what it means. The question that kept coming up in all of these conversations was the same question that Sinatra's radio comments had raised, but now it was being asked differently, not as a dismissal but as a genuine inquiry. What is the relationship between age and depth? What is the relationship between lived experience and artistic truth? Is it possible for a young person to sing about feelings with the same authenticity as someone who has lived longer? Sinatra did not respond publicly to the concert. He was not the kind of man who issued corrections or reversals or public acknowledgments that someone had surprised him. But people who were close to him during that period said that he had been told about the reviews and that he had read them with an attention that suggested he was not indifferent to their content. What is important to understand about this story is not that one man won and another man lost. That is the simple version. The version that makes for a satisfying headline but does not capture what actually happened. What actually happened was more complicated and more interesting. Frank Sinatra had been expressing a genuine belief, one that was shared by many serious musicians of his generation, about the relationship between age and artistic depth. That belief was not simply wrong. There is truth in the idea that lived experience informs art, That knowing loss and joy and the full weight of time gives a performer something that pure natural talent cannot fully substitute for. But Frankie Lymon had also been expressing something genuine, not in words, but in music. He had been expressing the truth that artistic depth is not exclusively a function of age. That a young person who has known poverty and belonging and displacement, and the particular joy and longing of being alive in a specific place at a specific moment, can access something real and true in music that is not less valuable for being arrived at differently. That the question of authenticity in art is not answered simply by looking at a performer's birth certificate. Both of these things can be true at the same time. The best art usually emerges from exactly this kind of creative tension, from the collision of different ideas about what music is for and where it comes from and who has the right to make it. The spring of 1957 brought new records and new performances and new arguments about music and culture and what the country was becoming. Frank Sinatra continued to be Frank Sinatra, which meant that he continued to make music of extraordinary quality and sophistication, music that would outlast most of what was being recorded that year. He was not diminished by what had happened. He was, if anything, more committed than ever to the particular vision of music that he had spent his career articulating. And Frankie Lymon continued to be Frankie Lymon, which meant that he continued to perform with the kind of energy and presence that had filled Madison Square Garden that cold winter night. He was navigating a music industry that had not been built with people like him in mind, facing pressures and complications that would have been difficult for anyone to manage, let alone someone his age. The story of what happened to him in the years that followed is its own complicated and sometimes painful story, one that says more about the industry than it does about the man. But in that specific moment, in the winter of 1956 and the early days of 1957, what the story of Frankie Lymon and Frank Sinatra tells us is something that still matters. It tells us that the question of who has earned the right to be heard is never as simple as the people asking it want it to be. It tells us that dismissal, even when it comes from a place of genuine conviction and real expertise, can be the most powerful form of motivation. It tells us that the best response to someone telling you that you are not ready is not an argument, but a performance. Frank Sinatra said that music required age and experience and the weight that only time could provide. 20,000 people at Madison Square Garden said something different. They said that what music required was exactly what Frankie Lymon had walked out onto that stage and given them. No more and no less. Just the truth of what was inside him, delivered without reservation to the people who had come to receive it. That is, when you strip everything else away, what music has always required. It has always required someone willing to stand in the light and be completely honest. Whether that person is 50 years old or 20 does not change the fundamental nature of what is being asked of them, which is everything. Both Frank Sinatra and Frankie Lymon understood this. One of them had simply understood it for longer. The other had understood it more recently. And on one particular winter night in New York City, in a building full of 20,000 people who had come looking for something real, the more recent understanding was enough. More than enough. The argument that began on a Tuesday afternoon radio broadcast continued in music criticism and cultural conversation for years afterward. It was not really an argument about two specific men, though it used their names. It was an argument about what music is, where it comes from, who gets to make it, and what we are asking for when we sit down to listen. These questions do not have final answers. They are the questions that keep music alive, that create the tension from which new sounds and new voices and new possibilities emerge. Frank Sinatra went on to record some of the finest music of his career in the years following that broadcast. Albums that are still considered among the most important recordings in American popular music. His voice deepened with time in exactly the way he had described, carrying more weight, more shadow, more of the particular gravity that comes from having lived through many things. Frankie Lymon went on to demonstrate, night after night, in performances across the country, that what he had done at Madison Square Garden was not an exception. It was a statement of what he was capable of when he decided to hold nothing back. The radio interview that started all of this was not, in the end, remembered as an attack. It was remembered as a provocation. And provocations, when they land on the right person at the right moment, do not diminish, they ignite. That is the story of what happened between Frank Sinatra and Frankie Lymon in the winter of 1956. It is a story about music and age and dismissal and response. But more than anything else, it is a story about what happens when someone tells you that you are not ready and you decide, quietly and completely, to show them otherwise, not with words, not with arguments, with the only thing that ultimately matters in music, which is the sound itself, offered fully and without reservation to everyone willing to listen. If this story moved you, if it made you think about what it means to answer doubt with action rather than words, then share it with someone who needs to hear it right now. Someone who has been told they are too young, too inexperienced, not ready. Someone who is carrying something real inside them and has not yet found the courage to let it out completely. Because the most powerful answer to doubt has never been an argument. It has always been a performance. It has always been the moment when you walk out into the light and give everything you have. Subscribe for more stories about the moments in music history that changed everything. Ring the notification bell so you never miss what comes next. And tell us in the comments, has anyone ever told you that you were not ready? What did you do about it?